In this section, we'll look at the foreign policy of Lyndon Johnson from 1963 to 1968. I should note that Vietnam War dominated Lyndon Johnson's foreign policy, but that is discussed in a separate lecture. So we'll look at the foreign policy outside of the Vietnam War. I should also note that in a general sense, LBJ wanted to focus on his domestic agenda, the Great Society, but the reality was that he was constantly diverted by crises around the world. LBJ had a number of tensions even with American allies throughout his term. LBJ wanted better coordination of NATO's nuclear capacity and proposed a fleet manned by mixed crews under a multinational NATO command. Britain at first objected. She was afraid of losing control over her own nuclear arsenal to the more powerful United States. But Britain was soon concluding that it was falling behind in technology, and the Americans arranged for the advanced Polaris nuclear systems to be sent to Great Britain if Britain agreed to have those missiles under NATO's projected multinational nuclear command, and also to stop developing her own missiles. Britain agreed with the provision that they agreed with the division as long as they could pull out the missiles, order the missiles out whenever they wanted it. The French, however, rejected these provisions. They still wanted to develop their own nuclear missiles. You know, Charles de Gaulle, after World War II, sort of represented a resurgent French nationalism, and they even opposed the common market in many respects. Things got so bad that in March 1966, the French announced that they were withdrawing all French forces from NATO, although they would remain a member officially. When de Gaulle asked for American troops to leave, Secretary of State Dean Rusk reportedly asked if that meant the U.S. should remove all the bodies of the American servicemen in French cemeteries. With the French withdrawal, the headquarters of NATO was moved to Brussels, Belgium in 1967, where of course it remains today. Johnson and NATO had another problem because Greece and Turkey were both NATO members, but they both claimed control of the island of Cyprus, and so there was a lot of internal tension within NATO. Eventually, in 1974, Turkey invaded and occupied the northern part of the island, but tensions remained high. Johnson also faced problems in Latin America, especially with the Panama Canal. In January 1964, only a couple months after Johnson entered the White House, students at Balboa High School in the U.S.-controlled Canal Zone demanded that Panama's flag be flown alongside the U.S. flag outside their school. Sounds kind of silly, but riots broke out, and 21 Panamanians and 3 American soldiers were eventually killed, and Panama ended up breaking off relations. Well, both sides agreed to the Organization of American States, the OAS, to mediate the dispute, and the result was a draft agreement providing the Panamanians a more limited, at least a greater say in some of the canal's management and profits. The problem was the agreement was never signed or ratified because obstacles to ratification arose in both countries. The Panamanians felt like it was their land and they should have control, and the Americans felt like, they had built it and they should have control. Turmoil in the Dominican Republic posed other problems. 3 different governments had existed since 1960, and the U.S. feared that communist insurgents might take advantage of the ensuing civil wars and turn it into another Cuba. And so in April 1965, LBJ sent a contingent of Marines, and they in fact were soon followed by over 20,000 American soldiers. The other Latin American troops also sent token forces, so they can call it a multinational force. With the soldiers present, order was restored and elections were held, and Johnson did eventually withdraw troops. But in many respects, this was another incidence of America having to intervene abroad in a way she didn't want. Another big problem, of course, was the Middle East, which sort of exploded on Johnson's presidency as well, with the a war that was in 1967 known as the Six-Day War. Since the fighting in 1956, the Suez Crisis, UN peacekeeping troops had patrolled the border between Israel and Egypt. The problem was that there were Palestinian Arab guerrillas, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they were launching attacks into Israel from Arab countries, with or without that nation's knowledge or whether they had been proved or not. In the spring of 1967, some of these terrorist raids came from the Syrian-controlled Golan Heights, which literally overlooks the northern part of Israel. And this is going to spark a retaliatory raid from Israel. Syria was, of course, upset and then cited a defense pact it had with its Arab friends. And so what you see is not only Syria beginning to mobilize, but Egypt as well. Egyptian leader Nasser, no friend of the United States, at first requested United Nations troops as peacekeepers, but then began to move in his own troops, promising a blockade of Israel. With a blockade tantamount to a war, Israel decided to launch a sort of preemptive sudden offensive on June 5, 1967. They routed the surprise Egyptian army. Of course, the Israelis had modern American warfare, and they destroyed the Egyptian Air Force. Jordan entered the war, and Israel crushed them as well. By the time a United Nations-sponsored ceasefire was agreed to on June 10th, the sixth day of the war, and thus it's called the Six-Day War, Israel was the obvious victor. And what Israel did was she kept the territories she had conquered as sort of a buffer zone. And the territories included the large swath of Egypt, known as the Sinai, all the way over to the Suez Canal, and a portion of the Mediterranean coast, known as the Gaza Strip, as well as the West Bank, which was a land that had really been part of Jordan and was on the west river of the Jordan River, and it went all the way over to Jerusalem, and of course the Golan Heights. The Soviet Union reinforced the defeated Arab armies, and so the tensions remained high, and actually the terrorist raids continued. I should note that Israel returned the Sinai to Egypt with the Camp David Accords in 1978, which are discussed in a separate lecture. Syria and Syria agreed to eventually give up the Golan Heights and Jordan the West Bank, and it is today these are the territories occupied by Israel, but there's still no resolution of the Palestinian people there. Despite all of this, direct relations between the United States and the Soviet Union really didn't worsen during Johnson's tenure. In 1964, a bloodless coup took place in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Communist Party removed Khrushchev as first secretary of the Central Committee of the party, which was kind of like the country's true leader, and replaced him with a former army officer and party functionary, Leonid Brezhnev. The party also installed Alexei Kosygin as premier. Brezhnev was cautious by nature and less provocative, which was a good thing for the Cold War in the United States. In 1967, the U.S. and the Soviet Union concluded a treaty prohibiting the use or deployment of nuclear weapons in outer space. The following year, the two countries joined over 60 others in signing a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. This treaty was really controversial, especially with sort of the very conservative hawks in Congress, but the Senate finally ratified it in March 1969. Like Khrushchev, however, Brezhnev could still be brutal in putting down threats to Soviet control in Eastern Europe, even as he pursued détente with the United States. In 1968, you see a great example of this. The Czech leader Alexander Dubček began a policy of liberation, the so-called Prague Spring. It was a loosening of state control and a lot of nationalism. Brezhnev was going to have none of it. He got Warsaw troops sent in. The United States and much of the world condemned the assault, but the Soviet Union had a veto power in the UN, and they learned, of course, not to boycott the UN from the Korean War, but they would use the veto and prohibit any type of official UN condemnation. And in fact, the following year, in 1969, Dubček was removed from power by the Soviets. Perhaps, in retrospect, one of the more notable developments in foreign policy during Lyndon Johnson's years, outside of Vietnam, of course, was the growing rift between the two communist superpowers, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. They had different interpretations of communism, and of course China had no intention, as I say, of being sort of dominated by the a Comintern run by the Soviet Union. They have a lot of historical and animosities between them that didn't just go away. Ultimately, these developments probably influenced Brezhnev's general, more conciliatory policies toward the United States. And in later years, of course, President Richard Nixon he provided to Nixon an opportunity to advance American interest as well. That is, of course, covered in a future lecture. This concludes a lecture on foreign policy during Johnson year outside of Vietnam.